You're listening to episode 44 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Christiane Wolf and Greg Serpa join us to talk about their new book, A Clinician's Guide to Teaching Mindfulness, the comprehensive session-by-session program for mental health professionals and healthcare providers. Let's say you're a clinician, treating patients on a regular basis for their mental and emotional difficulties. You hear about a new technique called mindfulness and decide to get a book, read it, and integrate that into your practice. Unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. Mindfulness is not a technique, nor is it something you can simply pick up after a day-long seminar. It represents the potential for a fundamental shift in how we live, how we relate to the world around us and within us. And it is built upon a solid and long-term personal, formal, contemplative practice. But even if you happen to be that clinician with a long-standing meditation practice and several years of training at the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, there are nuances particular to the clinical applications of mindfulness training. Christiane Wolf, MD, PhD, is a physician turned mindfulness teacher, teacher's trainer, writer, and speaker. Her mindfulness practice started in the late 1980s. Before becoming a full-time mindfulness teacher, she was a board-certified OB/GYN at the Humboldt University of Berlin, Germany. She also holds a PhD in psychosomatic medicine from Humboldt University. Dr. Wolf is a certified senior mindfulness-based stress reduction MBSR teacher and supervisor for the Center for Mindfulness at University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is the director of MBSR programs at Insight LA, a Los Angeles-based nonprofit, and the director of the VA Calm program at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System, training staff and clinicians in mindfulness and how to teach it. J. Greg Serpa, PhD, is a clinical psychologist for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System. He teaches mindfulness to America's veterans and is the first full-time mindfulness teacher and trainer in the federal system. Greg is an associate clinical professor in the psychology department at the University of California, Los Angeles, and an associate visiting clinical scientist at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He teaches intensive mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness self-compassion, and introductory level mindfulness classes at 4 area hospitals, and serves as a trainer, supervisor, and consultant to clinicians at the VA and UCLA. He is currently the director of interprofessional mental health education at the West Los Angeles VA. Our guests today are Christiane Wolf. Christiane, nice to speak with you again.
Hi, and nice to speak to you too.
And Greg Serpa. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Ted. Great to be here.
So very glad that you're both here. We've been talking about having a conversation for a while now, and I'm glad we've had this. But I'd like to start by asking you each to tell a little bit about your backgrounds. How did you come to mindfulness? And Christiane, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. I have a very interesting background in mindfulness. And for me, it's still very curious that I'm here in Los Angeles, living in Los Angeles and teaching mindfulness and training mindfulness teacher full time. Very strange that that would happen to me. So for me, I encountered Buddhism when I finished high school. And I was really looking for like a higher meaning in life and spiritual path. And I totally fell in love with Buddhism. And that was in the Vipassana tradition. So Ajahn Chah, Thai forest monastery tradition. And for me, what really sold me over was the whole idea of like, you don't have to believe anything. You just have to practice and see for yourself. Totally worked for my scientific mind, being curious. And so I started meditating. And then I even stayed for a couple of weeks in a monastery 2 years in a row and was really considering if this would be a path for me to ordain. But then just life was calling quite strongly to me being like 18 or 19. And I also got accepted into medical school at that same time, around that same time. And so I decided to just do that, become a physician, which I had been wanted to do since I was 15, probably. So went through medical school, meditated, and I think it really helped me to get through the whole stress of medical school and then later through residency.
I was going to ask if that was something that you expected maybe gave you a hand over your fellow students who didn't meditate.
Yes, I mean, it totally did. I think I got through the whole thing more relaxed than a lot of my colleagues, and definitely with a different perspective, knowing that there's this whole other world view out there. So very helpful. And then especially working with people. And then, so I became a OBGYN, and my specialty actually was gynecological oncology. So working with cancer patients, and I really noticed a difference in how I was able to be with the suffering of my patients. And so very, very helpful. But it never occurred to me that I would teach mindfulness to my patients, because back then it was not, secular mindfulness didn't really exist, or not, didn't exist like in my vision in a way. Berlin, back then, Berlin, Germany. Yeah, and then it would have been teaching my religion to my patients, which would have been not appropriate. So I'm actually very, very happy that now we are able to do that. We can really teach these skills very explicitly to our patients. So that was how I started out, and I thought I would go on like that and just be a meditating, practicing Buddhist and also being a physician. And then got married. We had our first baby, and my husband had the fun idea to go to LA for a year because he got a job there. And I thought, sure, why not? I can be on maternity leave. I can leave my job at the university there. And we would just have a year of fun at the ocean here in LA, and then would go back.
Just a year.
Yeah, just a year, exactly. And it's often when I tell that story, people say like, oh yeah, you're one of them, right? Or you're one of us. So there's some people who got stuck in LA and they never left, which is really interesting. So what was interesting is, so I wasn't interested particularly in the US, I'm sorry to say, definitely not in Los Angeles, thinking like, oh my God, yeah, all the prejudices that we have as Germans around Los Angeles and Hollywood and all of that. But anyways, so I told my husband, so we can go. I have one question, or like I need one thing, and I need a sitting group there, because I knew that if I wouldn't have a group to sit with on a regular basis, I would really fall off the wagon with my practice, and that wouldn't be a good thing. So it was funny. So I went online and I looked up the Spirit Rock website, Jack Kornfield, who had been like a person I had admired for many years. And it turned out that Trudy Goodman, who is now my and also Greg's heart teacher here in LA, that she had just founded inside LA a couple of months earlier and had just moved to Los Angeles. So there was a sitting group for me to go to. And I literally went to Trudy's sitting group the first week, maybe the second week when we moved to LA. And yeah, the rest is kind of history. It's really strange how that all unfolded. So this is how I came to LA, how I started to practicing here. Or maybe another thing that I should add. So how I came to teach mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is, but pretty much Trudy suggested that I would do this because she had been good friends with Jon Kabat-Zinn since they were both teenagers. Very interesting story. And she had taught with him MBSR in the early 80s in Worcester in Massachusetts. And she said, you're a physician and you're going to go back to Germany. Why don't you learn that while you're here? And I thought, well, that's a good idea. And let me tell you this, I had big prejudice about MBSR, thinking like, that can't be real Buddhism. That won't work, right? Like, how can you teach this? And how can you take the Buddha out of mindfulness? And I was in for a surprise. So I started teaching MBSR, really, really loved it. And then over time became a trainer of MBSR and becoming also involved in the supervision process for the Center of Mindfulness. Yeah, I totally love it. And I'm just so in awe still of the potential of transformation that people often go through, or really the transformation in just 8 weeks of an MBSR class.
Wonderful. And I think that's an experience many of us who come from tradition, we still love the tradition. There's nothing wrong with it. And yet there's this very strong resonance for how mindfulness in an MBSR kind of context, not just that program, there are others as well, resonates and has so much potential for everyone, not just those of us who are in line or interested in Buddhism, but also just people from their shared human experience. Thank you. Thank you for that story, Christiane. Greg, how about you? Tell us about your background. How did you first stumble across mindfulness?
I grew up in Central California in a tiny little farm town, literally down a dirt road in the middle of the cotton field then. And I had a term paper, I think my junior year, I must have been maybe 16 or 17. And I wanted to do something really kind of out there. And I was always drawn to meditation. And the closest I could find was TM, Transcendental Meditation. So this was maybe 1979. And I lied to my parents. I snuck out of the house to drive about 60 miles away to a bigger city that had a TM center back then. And they were really great. They gave me a couple of books, and I had a little lesson right then, and I just knocked on the door, a little introductory meditation practice. And they were kind of encouraging me, and I got hooked. To this day, my parents didn't know that here I was driving. I mean, that was far to drive away from home that way. And I was a TM practitioner probably for about 15 years. And I would say, as I was negotiating my own coming out experience right when the AIDS crisis was hitting, this was a very crazy and intense time with a lot of things going on. And one of my very dear friends was a Buddhist, and we were talking about our practices. And he's still very involved. He's was a research RN doing HIV research. And we were just, with some gallows humor thinking, are we going to be the only ones left alive here? It was really rough. And, he started really talking about some of the fundamental principles of Buddhism and this approach that were new to me despite being a long-term practitioner. And I started going with him to a Buddhist center. That was really fascinating to me, but a little foreign. And I was like getting it and not. I was intrigued, and the nuns that were talking were speaking from a framework that, as someone that was also in a doctoral program for clinical psychology, didn't quite fit my Western framework. And I struggled with it. And I was there for at the Buddhist Center for over a year, like wanting to get it, but not feeling the fit all that much. And then dropped out for a bit. And it wasn't until I went to Inside LA that I had this eureka moment. And with the guiding teacher there, Trudy Goodman, it really felt like this is speaking to me deeply. And that's how that happened with me. So more and more, right as I was becoming a clinical psychologist and being involved in that training and that work, I was also practicing more and more and part of the Sangha at Inside LA. And I didn't see how my two worlds fit together until my internship year when the MBCT book came out. And there was, I was like, people are actually talking about mindfulness, like it's this new thing. And of course, I've been a long time practitioner. And at the Department of Veterans Affairs, where I was a psychology trainee and I'm a psychologist there now, I started a mindfulness group, and it was in 2003. And that was, everyone's like, what in the world is that? And it was completely novel, but it was very fun and exciting for me to do. And just I ended up branding myself sort of in the eyes of the clinical staff as the mindfulness guy, the guy that was doing that. And here we are all these years later, and it's my full-time job for the VA to be a mindfulness teacher and teacher trainer.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to continue, Craig, with you for a moment and have you tell us a bit more about your work with veterans, because that's something that's near and dear to a few of us.
It is a great privilege for me to serve the men and women who've served our country. And this is a very diverse population of folks that represent the country, particularly here in Los Angeles. We have an enormous population of homeless veterans, which overlaps quite a bit with veterans with histories of interaction with the justice system and incarceration, with substance use disorders, serious mental illness, and many different kinds of folks. It's a very diverse setting. And what I noticed in my own world on retreats and in my own mindfulness communities, a lot of these, folks and these populations weren't the same folks that were sitting in the meditation room with me. So, there was a big question. Is this going to speak to them? Can this be a pathway to healing and to feeling whole and complete in one's life? Is this even going to make sense? And, since 2003, I was an intern and was gone for a year for a postdoc and then returned immediately to be a staff psychologist at the VA. It's such a fantastic place, in part because the patient population, it's just amazing. It's my privilege to work with them, and they get it, and it speaks to them, and their lives are transformed. And it's been really rich and rewarding work, and I feel really lucky to have had the opportunity to do it.
Thank you very much for sharing that, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Christiane, how about you? Tell us a bit about Insight LA.
Yeah, Inside LA has become really my spiritual home. So as I mentioned earlier, Trudy Goodman, who is a hybrid Zen and Vipassana teacher, she founded that in 2002, November 2002. And I moved to LA in the summer of 2003. So I've been around for most of its existence. And it was really started with a sitting group, how often centers start. You want a Sangha, right? And so you gather some people, and then the word gets out that this is good. And there's a teacher who is wonderful, and it starts growing. And then you add classes, and it was very organic. And it's quite amazing, like what we have grown in the last decade. So what is really interesting about Inside LA is that we really have both arms of the practice. So what we call secular mindfulness. I'm very careful with that word. I don't really like it, but this is the way that most people recognize it these days. So basically the mindfulness without the explicit Buddhism in it, then the very explicit Buddhist arm. So we teach mindfulness-based classes, and then we teach the Buddhist path. And we do that under one roof. And I think we can definitely do this here in LA. I know that some other centers in urban centers are really looking at our model and looking at like, how are they doing this? Because for me, it's really more about how we say things. So it's not, for me, the teachings really are not different. It's just how I translate them into so that people can understand them. And this is really what the Buddha did, right? So in Buddhism, we have the term is called upaya, which means skillful means. And he used that all the time. He was talking in different ways to a king, then to a prostitute, then to a farmer. And he was finding the words and examples that everybody would just, not everybody, but the people who would get it, they would understand it immediately. And I really feel that this is what we're doing, is we're using words that people can understand. We get people where they are at. And the science really helps with that. And in a way, like, who cares why people practice, honestly? If it's the spiritual, they've come from one spiritual path, or if they just want to reduce their suffering, to me, that's actually the same. And so I think we're understanding this very well here at Inside LA, and we're practicing this, and we want to really be a model to say, like, no, it's not dualistic. They're not two things. It's the same thing.
Yeah, and that's been an ongoing conversation in the community, and we've seen online some discussions about that. Even at a recent conference at the Center for Mindfulness, a discussion came up about wanting to shift this into mutual support and bridge building rather than some of what we've been seeing lately, which might not be as mutually beneficial. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. What made you two decide to collaborate on a book? Christiane, why don't we start with you?
In 2011, Inside LA was invited to facilitate and implement mindfulness at the VA and train and collaborate with what was already there, which was mostly Greg doing his classes, which he had been doing quite a while before we actually came on board. We received a grant from the VA and have been since implementing programs there. So we've taught MBSR classes, trained mindfulness facilitators, trained staff, developed online classes, developed toolkits. And now it's really at a point where we also have some dissemination for the national VA system, which is really, really wonderful. So we have been collaborating there since 2011 and training people, and we found ourselves just saying the same things over and over. Like, this is how you teach us. This is what mindfulness is not. Don't read a script. You need to come from your own practice. No, you actually do have to practice. This is not just a technique. It's not just like what you put in your toolkit. It's like, oh, what do we do today? Visualization or mindfulness or both, right? So, and people were saying, well, do you have that written down somewhere? We're like, no, we don't. And then at some point, we just thought, like, God, we need to write it down just to make it easier for ourselves. And then we started to write it down, and we thought, like, this actually could become a book. And so that's how that started.
Greg, what would you like to add to that story about how you got involved in collaborating on it?
You know, the VA is a wonderful, but sometimes bureaucratic place. So I was teaching on mindfulness, and I have a lot of, as an attending, I have a lot of supervisees in various disciplines, psychiatry residents, psychology interns and fellows, social work trainees and others. And they were all cycling through to train with me to see mindfulness in action. And I had started an MBSR program, and I was keeping my head down because I was really afraid that the bean counters may not fully support that. So I was filled with dread that any moment my phone might ring And I might get someone saying, what are you doing? What is this? We don't really think this fits in here. And of course, the funny thing is, I am a frontline person, and I had no idea that there was this enormous national movement going on simultaneously to bring mindfulness into the VA. So here I am trying to keep my head down. And as it turns out, the Los Angeles VA was designated one of the national centers for innovation for integrative modalities of care. There's a big national office in Washington, the Office of Patient-Centered Care and Cultural Transformation, which was funding a variety of programs, but in particular mindfulness, really wanting to bring in and ensure that we were doing best practices. So, I'm getting phone calls from people saying, are you interested in doing this more, rather than you need to stop doing this? And that I was really shocked by that. And I find out that the national experts being pulled in as consultants for me to work with were my friends at Inside LA, and in fact was Trudy Goodman, who was my heart teacher, and Christiane as our lead consultant. And Christiane and I actually at the time knew each other a bit because I had taken MBSR with her, and she's, of course, a brilliant MBSR teacher. But we hadn't quite worked together yet. So it was just meant to be. I was doing mindfulness and trying to keep my head down so I wouldn't get the bureaucratic smackdown. But as it turned out, the national VA was funding and supporting our local VA to be the laboratory to create programming and to create toolkits and to create a dissemination program for the entire national network. And, this is important because the VA healthcare system is the largest healthcare system in the United States. So this is how Christiane and I started working together in my role as a full-time psychologist, and in her role as, our national expert and consultant as part of this program.
Wonderful. And then as you continued to work together, what, from your perspective, how did that lead to that gem of, we got a book here?
Right. So we are at this fascinating time in history where we have the confluence, I feel, of three streams of information. This stream of ancient teachings, it's 2,500 years old, is one stream. The other stream that's coming in is modern neuroscience and the Western scientific approach to better understand what is happening with these practices. So that's meeting in here. And then the kind of third stream that's bringing this all together is a group of clinicians that are really interested in learning how to teach others and using mindfulness in their professional identity, in their professional practice. So, a generation ago, the modal teacher in the United States was typically someone who had traveled to the forest monasteries of Southeast Asia and had returned and started the center or maybe had been ordained, maybe not. That was kind of the modal practitioner. And this is really the last generation that type of teacher is in the West, I think. The person that we're going to see is the modal teacher. But this, of course, as everyone is well aware, this is a hot topic of conversation. There's a lot of concern about this. And I think it's correct that there's a lot of concern for this. So I've had numerous occasions when I had to be gone to a conference or out on sick leave or whatever that I needed a group covered, and would have a number of colleagues that I have high esteem for in a number of different disciplines and say, oh gosh, I need my mindfulness group covered, and I might tell them what we were doing or maybe not. And they'd say, oh, I'm happy to do it. It's fun. I'd love to do it. I'd love to cover your mindfulness group. Great. I come back the next week and I ask the patients, so how did that go? And they perfectly describe that they were taught progressive muscle relaxation. And I got the feedback from the clinician, whether it was a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a social worker, telling me, oh, we had a great mindfulness class. They really loved it, right? And I would hear this and I think, wow, what is going on here? Well, as it turns out, we don't really say facial tissues anymore. We say Kleenex. Well, there's some regionalisms there. We don't say on the West Coast, we don't say soda pop or carbonated beverage. We say Coke, and it becomes a generic, I think, for all kinds of things.
What kind of Coke do you want? Pepsi?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, same here.
Exactly. So there's some regional differences, but we're at this point that sometimes people are saying mindfulness to mean anything that you do with your eyes closed.
Right.
Right. Or anything that they think is relaxation because they don't understand what mindfulness is and they think it's relaxation. And then there's a lot of interference where you have male, well-meaning clinicians who've been trained in a number of modalities and things start to bleed one thing into another. And they don't have the theoretical understanding and the specifics of exactly what is what. So I'd long had that experience. And, then we were Center for Innovation. We're supposed to be developing these programs. And I'm working with Christiane and laughing all the time saying another person who is doing some guided imagery or progressive muscle relaxation or something else. And they're telling people that this is mindfulness. And we're seeing that happen. So we started thinking we need to help people understand what this is. So we've certainly did many, many staff trainings. We still offer a yearly MBSR for clinicians at our local, very, very large VA, urban VA, and mindfulness facilitator trainings and online courses and many different things to help people really understand better what mindfulness is. And as we were in this work, we found with different groups who were really saying some of the same things. So we really wanted to get some of these basic points down and just jotting notes down. And from this, it's like, boy, we have a book here. And it's a book that can support the many exceptional skills that clinicians have spent years, even decades to hone to do clinical work, to be with someone who's suffering, to be able to sit with someone that is in a lot of distress or is maybe terminally ill or whatever. All the skills that clinicians bring can be incredibly helpful, but they do need specific training to understand what mindfulness is and how to use that effectively in the clinical setting. And from this idea, the book was born.
Thank you for that. And I'd like you to continue with telling us a little bit, Greg, about, we know the book is for clinicians. It's part of the title. And I'm wondering if you could round that out a little bit. And then, Christiane, I want to ask you the same thing.
We wrestled with that in our setting. Clinicians is a pretty kind of broad category, and yet it typically means individuals who are licensed for independent practice. But certainly, we think this is the book is intended for a much wider audience, and not just for mental health providers, but providers of every stripe. So many of our core participants in our mindfulness facilitator programs that we've held are mental health providers, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, master's level psychology, MFTs and such, and psychiatric nurses. And that has been the core. But we also have a unlicensed category of provider called a health coach. And they've been doing a lot of work with mindfulness across the country. There are folks that we've had, take our programs in primary care, in medicine, in GI, in oncology, in rehab, in physical therapy, and also the chaplaincy service has expressed an interest. So many different folks that may not identify themselves as a clinician have been interested in the programs, and I think would be interested in the book as well.
Christiane, how about you? Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to add something to this, which is one of the things is very practical. The title Teaching Mindfulness was already taken. That would have been our first choice because, I mean, we are both clinicians and this is our collaboration came mostly really from teaching just the populations that Greg just mentioned. And at the same time, we are explaining how do you teach a mindfulness of breathing? How do you teach a body scan? How do you teach a mindful eating exercise? And that has nothing to do with patients or with a clinic or not even with healthcare, right? Because that is the same across the board with some exceptions, of course, right? So the book is a really good choice for anybody who wants to share mindfulness with somebody else as a source because it is so practical. It's so down to earth. It's really like, okay, you do this, you don't do this. This is what you pay attention to. And it's really, I mean, we haven't really found anything out there that explain it really to this detail, the how to teach.
Wonderful. And speaking of teaching mindfulness, I hold in my hand Don McCown's business card. He will be a guest on the podcast soon, so we'll get to talk about that as well. So let's talk about the book itself. You mentioned that it's session by session, and I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about the program structure, maybe how it relates to other MBIs. Christiane, let's start with you.
Yes, I would actually like to go one step back, and because it has different chapters. So the session by session is the last big chunk or chapter of the book where we really go session by session. I'll get to that in a moment. But what we started with is really this understanding, which is so crucial for us, that you need to have your own practice before you start teaching mindfulness. And this is how you do this. So this is how you start your own practice if you haven't yet. This is how you support your own practice if you're struggling with your practice. This is why retreat practice is really important. So we are starting with the whole setup is around like if you want to teach mindfulness, you have to have your own practice. Very, very important. And then we have a section on then the actual how to teach the different aspects. And then we move into the different sessions. And the sessions is so what we have in there, it is 6-week session. And the idea is that this ideally would be taught for 90 minutes. It can be adapted down to 1 hour. But the understanding really is, and so especially because I'm so steeped in the MBSR program and eternally grateful to John Kabat-Zinn for coming up with this. Honestly, I'm so in awe of this, just the MBSR program. But the idea also is, or the understanding, or what we came to understand, this is probably what I want to say, is that in a lot of clinical settings, for people to commit to a 2-hour or 2.5-hour class once a week is to ask too much. So that's definitely something that we came across at the VA, and we were teaching MBSR in the 2-hour setting there. But a lot of people are not interested to really dive in at that level, and especially they're not willing to commit to like 45 minutes of daily practice. And so how can we make this accessible to people who potentially might want to go further, but maybe not. Maybe they just don't want or need that much at this point. So that was one question that we had. And so to come up with a 6-week program that's just shorter, but has a lot of elements, of course, as MBSR, or has the background of the 4 foundations of mindfulness in its training. So that is where that is coming from. And then we have added 2 more sessions because just our personal history, what happened was as we were writing the book, we both got trained in mindful self-compassion, and we thought like, oh my God, we really need to add this. This is really important. And maybe Greg can later just say a little bit about his experience with teaching mindful self-compassion to veterans, which is maybe not something that goes together in people's minds so easily, a veteran and mindful self-compassion. So we added some of these components in another session and then also another one on resiliency. So really with this idea that people can be very flexible, they can teach a 6-week class really as an introduction to mindfulness class, but they can also adapt elements of this class to their groups. So I don't know, start an addiction group with 5 minutes of mindfulness of breathing or a short body scan. So to make it really very practical for the providers.
Greg, how about you? What are your thoughts on how the program relates to other MBIs? What calls out to you about it?
One of the essential elements is the structure of the book and the various sections, as Christiane mentioned, the really session by session recommendations for how to teach an introductory mindfulness class is really the third part of the book. The previous sections is your own personal practice, the importance of embodiment, the importance of understanding what mindfulness is, how to lead a practice, and how to integrate this into potentially different clinical settings. Because I'm both an MBSR and an MSc teacher, I am deeply nourished and rewarded by doing this work. It's fantastic. And I will tell you that it is a high bar for participants. So, for example, we have many veterans coming through day treatment programs for the psychiatric issues or substance abuse issues or physical medicine or chronic pain. All of these clinical populations, they're not specifically seeking a path of enlightenment. They're not seeking any particular mindfulness approach. They're just suffering. They're in physical or mental or both. And there's a lot of dukkha. There's a lot of suffering, and they want relief. And having a mechanism that can meet consumers of healthcare or anyone where they are without having to commit to a highly intensive 2 to 2.5 hour with a retreat program with 30 to 45 minutes of practice a day, that's really a high bar to jump over. So this was intentional for us because I know in all the mindfulness groups, the thousands of visits or encounters, as we say, that we have with veterans, the numbers that choose to go for an intensive practice like MBSR is just a fraction. And yet there's a richness that you can introduce people to. So, for example, in our largest outpatient substance abuse program, we have an intensive outpatient program that's 3 days a week. It's about 12 to 14 hours of specific programming and evidence-based approaches to recovery from substances of abuse. So veterans come to this because they're using heroin or smoking crack cocaine or addicted to alcohol or pain pills, whatever it is. And as part of this, they're getting 1 hour a week of a introduction to mindfulness group. And that's integrated into part of the program. So this is the type of group and skill that fits really well, I think, in a medical setting. It's not for someone that specifically identifies, oh, I want to do mindfulness. I want to do an intensive training in mindfulness. I've heard all about the great research in MBSR. Most of these people haven't heard any of that before. And yet they get started. Sometimes they're very surprised by it, but they love it. And it speaks to them deeply. And we frequently have veterans in this group, they ask them, what do you think was the thing that was most important in terms of your recovery? What helped you the most? And they will say, it's been a joke in the clinic, the mindfulness class. This is the thing that helped me the most. And they're getting 1 hour of mindfulness out of 15 other hours of other kinds of relapse prevention and early recovery courses. So in terms of designing a book and an intervention, it's really based on working in clinical settings that you need things that are practical and accessible and can be taught by clinicians who have established their own practice and have a sense of skill and knowledge in what they're doing, but may not be able to meet the training criteria, for example, for an MBSR teacher, which is very intensive and needed. And we certainly support it. And the people that teach MBSR at our setting, follow the Center for Mindfulness's recommendations for this. And I think that's fantastic. But across our national network, people that work full time don't have the ability to really commit to that level of training to become certified in some of the MBIs. And they need something that is more accessible and practical.
Christiane, I want to shift to you on the next question, asking what are some of the interesting things you may have learned yourself during the writing process?
I think what really was wonderful for me was to see really how seamless the Dharma work and the mindfulness work are. And because at the same time as we were writing the book, I'm also in the current teacher training from Spirit Rock and the Insight Meditation Society, so Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein's program. So I'm going through this 4-year program, and this is really Dharma-based and teaches us to teach longer retreats. And really to see that there is no difference, and to see also how important it is that people who teach mindfulness need the Buddhist background. So what we have done in this book, I think, which is quite unique as far as I know, is we have added different sections. So we have a section that's called, or like a recurring feature that's called the clinical psychologist perspective, where Greg talks about certain aspects more from a psychologist point of view. And then we have the Dharma teacher perspective. And I really see that if, for example, if you don't know about dukkha, suffering, impermanence, and no self, then you are very limited on how you can meet people and how you can answer questions and guide people in their learning experience. Because, and especially in a clinical setting, most mental health providers are more taught to really stay with a personal story or the personal meaning for that person. And if we are coming really from this bigger person, the Dharma perspective, we can say like, oh, what the person is sharing is actually about suffering. This is about dukkha, or this is about impermanence. And then we can relate to them in a different way, and we can relate it in a way that everybody in the room will understand it on a different level. So it's not just about like, oh, your dog died and this is very painful and all the dog lovers in the room can relate. But this is actually really about impermanence and suffering. And this makes it so much richer. And I really feel so passionate about teaching people about that you can't take these teachings out. You don't teach them explicitly, but you need to know them. So anybody who teaches mindfulness has to have a basic understanding of core Buddhist teachings.
Greg, how about you? What are some of the things that you may have learned during the writing process?
There have been surprises along the way. And of course, having my own practice for many years, I also appreciate that teaching is part of my practice also. And I think it was 2011, I became a full-time, mindfulness teacher and teacher trainer for the federal government in my role at the VA. And since that time, I felt my own transformation doing this work and sharing it with the VA and now with the book. So part of the surprise is, I think, my own personal unfolding, my own opening up more deeply to the teachings and appreciating so much more the depth, the richness of what is here and what exists. it's quite ironic, I think, for me when, I'm with my Sangha immersed in the Dharma world. I'm, very much perhaps a psychologist and a clinical scientist. But when I'm doing my scientific work, I really feel I'm a student of the Dharma. And I think the book helped me really to integrate that and to see that in surprising ways. And of course, working so closely with such a wonderful and lovely teacher as Christiane has been a great joy. So I think that's what it was for me.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to stay with you on the next question. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges for clinicians when it comes to teaching mindfulness?
Boy, that's a hot topic.
I'm most proud of that question, actually, yeah.
And it was delivered without any spin. It was just like put out there. That was so beautifully done. And here, I think, is where the nut of it is. When I have one of my trainees tell me, "Oh, sure, I've done a lot of mindfulness. I've done this mindfulness group and that mindfulness group, and I've done this intervention, and I've done a lot of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and I'm formally trained in dialectical behavior therapy or DBT." And it's like, okay, great. Do you want to do? Oh, yeah, I'm happy to do a practice. And they'll go into a room with me, and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I've done hundreds of body scans." Okay, great. And then they pull out this sheet of paper with their script, and they start reading these words on the paper. And there's nothing wrong with the words on the paper, but there's no understanding that actually you are living in a body yourself.
Yeah, there's no authenticity or heartfulness.
There's no embodiment and authenticity, and that they've been doing this for a couple of years already. And it's not because, we are, as a training site for residencies, for internships, one of the most competitive in the country. We have hundreds of applicants for a handful of slots. I'm always humbled by how, brilliant and well-prepared and well-trained these students are. And there are dozens of publications so early in their training lives. And yet no one has had the opportunity to actually teach them how to lead a practice. So I think this is at the nut of what some of the issues are with clinicians. We know moving forward, the next generation of mindfulness facilitator is going to be someone that was trained in grad school, in psychology, in social work, in medical school, rather than thousands of people that were trained in forest monasteries. This is just how it is. So there needs to be a development and an understanding that meets the Western educated folks to better understand what it is that we're doing and have access to this. This is, I think, the core barrier that we hope the book will help address.
Excellent. Thank you. And Christiane, how about you? What do you see as some of those challenges for clinicians when it comes to teaching mindfulness?
Yeah, one is as the embodiment, as Greg mentioned, so that is really important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, really the perspective that the mindfulness teaching actually has. The bigger perspective that this is actually on some level, it's not about you. It's not about your story. This is the human condition. We all share this. Yeah, and that can get lost. That can get lost in somebody who is trained to really pay attention to the individual story. Another piece is also that is different is that as mindfulness practitioners, there is no hierarchy in the sense that there is between a therapist and a patient. So because we're mindfulness students, just like they are, and we are like this whole idea, we're not giving advice and we don't think there's actually something wrong with you and you don't need to be fixed. So that is something that we all, and as clinicians, I still fall into that, being so trained to fix people as a physician, is fall into this trap of thinking like, oh, I know what you need to do in order to fix this, right? So to be aware of that and to then just not go there. That is a whole practice in itself.
The other thing that I think is so interesting is this idea of intervention.
Yes. Yes.
And even, I think everyone is now using MBI for mindfulness-based intervention, and this operationalizing and putting something down in a list and doing this in this way. Somehow, I come from a psychology tradition that has all these various interventions where you can go for a weekend workshop and learn, how to do an intervention.
A technique.
Exactly. And you take your notes and you go into the room and, you just start doing it, and you're not very good at the beginning, and you need consultation and you need people maybe listening to your tapes to help you do it. But mindfulness, of course, is different. So this is something that clinicians are going to have some interference with, right? So that their previous learning, which has been successful for them, the way they have acquired knowledge and skills and have done that in the past, is now interfering with understanding a completely different way of being.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And in fact, adding on to something you had said, Christiane, about it's not about you is one thing. And then the clinical tendencies, the doing of therapy, the fixing part. One way in which I've seen this manifest sometimes is with teachers who are in that difficult role where their day job is doing therapy, and it's one-on-one, it's very focused, and it's really on the narrative, it's on the story, it's on that person. And that sometimes difficult to shift from that into the holding space, the spaciousness of having inquiry with one person that's nonetheless open to the group, that there's a tendency to then focus in on that individual and work on the fixing. And suddenly you shift into therapy mode instead of group inquiry and sharing and learning in that space in between. So I'd also like to ask, and Christiane, we'll start with you. What are you most hoping readers will get from the book?
I really hope that people understand on a very deep level or on an ever deepening level the potential of mindfulness that doesn't end with stress reduction. And it is, for me, really teaching mindfulness and training mindfulness teacher for me is part of my Dharma practice and part of my service. And I hope that people understand as they teach this, it's like, oh, I really do need to practice this in order to serve my students better. And that this will lead to really the wish to deepen your own practice, to find a teacher, to find a sangha, to find a group, and to start going on retreats. Because really what it boils down to is the practice will do the teaching. We're just holding space and we inspire people to practice. But it's not about the talking. It's not about what we say. It's just we get people to actually do it. And then when teachers understand this, they will want to practice more themselves. So that's what I really hope people will get from this book.
Thank you. Excellent point, Christiane. And Greg, how about you? What are you most hoping readers will get from the book?
As a clinician, the work we do, particularly with challenging high-risk populations, can be really depleting. It can be challenging. It can be grinding. More than anything, for me, I hope clinicians that read our book find not just a friendly, helpful, and authoritative guide to help them facilitate an introductory mindfulness class, but have that spark within them that's kindled to support and continue with their own practice, so they have a sense of being nourished, have a sense of being made whole to do the difficult work, the honorable work that clinicians do every day to help alleviate suffering.
Well, thank you, Greg. Is there anything else, starting with you, Greg, that you'd like to share with the listeners?
We are also doing quite a bit of research in mindfulness. We're really excited about a recent paper from our MBSR programs that was published in December of last year, 2014, demonstrating that MBSR significantly reduced depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation in veterans. Now, of course, these are very important areas of interest for the VA. But for me, this was a naturalistic study that we took all comers. And this is very different than most clinical studies. In most clinical studies, you have exclusion criteria, and someone that is actively suicidal would not participate in the study. Someone who is actively psychotic would not participate in the study. Someone who was actively using methamphetamines would not participate in the study. We had all of those types of folks participate in our MBSR class, and they, on average, saw improvements in anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And this is really exciting news for us. We have two other research projects that are in the works now, and the first is with some of my UCLA colleagues, where I'm a clinical scientist and a partner with Kirsten Tellish and Bruce Nalaboff, who are the principal investigators, in using MBSR and looking at biomarkers for irritable bowel syndrome. So in that study, which is so fascinating, they're getting pre and post brain scans, but in addition, getting stool samples to look at how meditation might change the microbiota in the gut. Because we know that there's, all this stuff happening in the gut, and these bacteria can produce things that look very close to serotonin, and this can affect mood. And we're really looking to explore some of these brain-gut meditation interactions. So that's one of our studies that we're excited about that's underway. And the other one is in veterans who've recently come back from Iraq and Afghanistan that have had traumatic brain injury. And very frequently with traumatic brain injury, there's post-traumatic headache that is intractable, that doesn't respond well to medications. And we are doing some brain scans pre and post MBSR to see if we see any differences with some of the pain mapping for some of the cortical biomarkers. So those are some of the interesting, exciting things that we're doing in our work. And I think that's it.
Great. Thank you. And I hope you'll come back later to speak about at least one of these papers, perhaps a few, because just today in a program that I was delivering, a question came up about depression and anxiety. And we've already been fortunate enough on the podcast to have Bob Stahl and Lynn Corbel and Florence from Center for Mindfulness speak about their new mindfulness-based resurrection for anxiety. We will be bringing on Mark Williams and some others on depression, but of course, an individual paper is also something I'd like to find out more about. So hope you'll be joining us at a later date for that.
Great. Thank you.
And Christiane, how about you? Is there anything else you'd care to share with the listeners?
Really just reiterating that, transformation happens through practice. And that is really our job as mindfulness teachers, to inspire people to practice however we do that and whichever language we use.
So the practice, as Christiane said, is so important for some of the transformations that I see. I really think that it is also Sangha. So we're in the populations that I treat, you can have someone that is incredibly isolated, that may be around people all day, but because he's homeless and he's sleeping under the bushes, doesn't actually spend time having any limbic resonance or actually any sense of being connected to anyone or with anything. So the practice, of course, is important, but practicing together as a group, that sense of a framework, I think, is part of what helps the transformations take place also.
Very good point. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. Our guest today, Christiane Wolf. Christiane, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having us.
And Greg Serpa. Greg, thank you for being here as well.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. And we certainly appreciate being here with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.